Before I start, I think it's probably important that I note that I'm speaking as an individual. I don't speak for my organization, which is probably important to say in the context of this being filmed. So the topic that I'm going to speak about today is called Excursions in Pirate Care in Palestine. And when the organizers of this topic sort of told me about this conference, I thought it was a kind of interesting concept to try and attempt to apply to a context like the occupied territories. Before we get to the occupied territories, though, I think it's important to note that pirate care emerges as a concept in an era marked by the hegemony of neoliberal capitalism. So basically for 40 years, we have had the encroachment, the advancement of neoliberal logics and frameworks that have promoted marketization, austerity, privatization, that has more or less colonized all forms of, all spheres of life. It has eroded the values of social democracy while also plundering many of the accomplishments of working class movements historically, both in the sort of advanced westernized countries, but also further afield, of course. In this context, technological advances such as algorithmic high-speed trading devices have allowed the amassment of enormous amounts of capital on behalf of the 1%. Also advancing and normalizing the logic of market and competition and the individual at the expense of rights-based approaches to social welfare provision, as well as the concept of public goods. Today, I looked up the statistics from Oxfam International, which showed that since the financial crisis in 2007, the number of billionaires has actually doubled, and 26 billionaires control the wealth of half of the world's population, which is astonishing figures, 26 people, so I don't know, count how many people are in this room. In any case, in this context, pirate care emerges in a context characterized by a gap that these dynamics have engendered between the needed services, protections, and rights for individual well-being and social reproduction overall, and the existing infrastructure and providers of services that are either not there, inaccessible, or too expensive. So this gap emerges as a kind of corollary, I would argue, to the decline and erosion of the values of social democracy, but also of the institutions of social democracy, which we see very clearly throughout Europe, in UK, in France, in Italy, in Germany, where the traditional social democratic parties, which used to espouse these values, are very much in decline and or engaged in severe fights over their identities. This has led to the collapse of the political center, as well as the polarization of debates and on either sides of the spectrum. In that regard, I think it's important to acknowledge that pirate care is a left-wing progressive response to these challenges, albeit one that is all too often defensive in nature, in a broader context of right-wing assault, so to speak. It's also important to acknowledge, I think, that pirate care is extra-parliamentary and outside the state, and it's not fully determined, or obviously it's not a watertight concept, but there are outstanding questions around pirate care about how does it negotiate with the state? Is it interested in purely maintaining its autonomy? Does it see itself as negotiating with the state, competing with the state, etc.? There are also important questions around pirate care that have to do with accountability and finance, I would argue, that I'll bring out in my talk, but we'll show how that goes later. So with these sort of introductory observations made, keep in mind, I think now let's turn to the question of the occupied territories. Because now you might find it a bit weird or awkward that we could take this concept, which is largely applicable to advanced westernized societies where you have an existing balance between labor and capital and certain accomplishments of the working class movement, and to apply them to a context like the occupied territories, which is under military occupation for more than 50 years, active settler colonial context, a situation of apartheid, no sovereignty, no state. And because no state, you have a situation of statelessness, which means you do not even have the right to have rights. So you do not have social or political rights that have even been acknowledged. So this extreme example might make an idea like pirate care seem not applicable, but I would also argue that because of its extremeness, it actually fleshes out dimensions of pirate care that might be less evident in a context like Western Europe, where many of the questions I will speak to are embedded in existing pirate care practices and dynamics, but are less observable and are more hidden. So the two examples that I wanted to look at was, the first one I wanted to look at was basically how the World Bank operated in the occupied territories when it first came there in 1993. Now, before I get there, I kind of have to provide a little bit of a background because the situation in occupied Palestine is not necessarily clear to everyone here. Basically, without going into a long history, in 1967, Israel comes to occupy the West Bank and Gaza Strip. This allows Israel to unite the conquest of 1948 with 1967. It is, however, a contradictory victory because when they come to occupy the West Bank and Gaza, there are more than 1 million Palestinians who actually remain there. This creates a contradiction for Israel insofar as Israel, which has always promoted itself as a Jewish democratic state, if it provided citizenship to this population, it would erode the, quote, Jewish character of the state. If it denied the citizenship, it would erode the, quote, democratic character of the state. So Israel's solution to this matter was simply to say, okay, from the new conquest, we'll take from it what we want, the ideological sites, the valuable resources, the water, the mountaintops, etc. And what we don't want is the Palestinian population there. And what we're going to try and do is to contain them and manage them in a way, ideally through some third-party body. Okay? Initially, the idea was to have the Jordanians or the Egyptians do this work. Later on, they transformed their ideas into the creation of the Palestinian Authority. It is within this context, in 1993, that the peace process takes place. And at that time is when the World Bank is basically tapped by the United States State Department to come into the negotiations process and work out the institutional and governance and economic dimensions of the peace process that was unfolding between the Israelis and Palestinians. And in that regard, the World Bank, which is an organization which represents the dominance of the triad, which is the United States, Western Europe, and Japan, the sort of the main capital formations of Western capitalism, so to speak, they were given the mandate to figure these issues out. And they had 3,000 economists with PhDs there who studied the situation across the occupied territories and very quickly figured out that the territory was a mess economically. And because, of course, Israel had been practicing what's known as de-development there. That means it's not that the occupied territories were developed or even underdeveloped, as which takes place in traditional sort of peripheries of around the metropole of imperialism. There was a process of de-development, meaning anytime Palestinians tried to develop horizontal linkages with one another, they were actively divided by the Israelis to prevent any form of genuine economic growth. But of course, the Israelis were not, the World Bank was not interested in pointing any figures at who is to blame over this situation or recognizing that the terrible economic situation there was the result of Israel's settler colonial policies and de-development. It wrote a report that came out literally 2 weeks after the Oslo peace process came out. It was a 6-volume study called An Investment in Peace, which is actually quite remarkable because supposedly the accords were secret and no one knew about them. But actually, the United States knew about them, those in power really knew about them, and they had sent the World Bank delegation to the occupied territories in the springtime when the peace process actually takes place. Finally is signed in September. 2 weeks later, this report comes out, in which the entire Palestinian economy, its governance structures, its infrastructure was more or less worked out from a World Bank perspective, how the Palestinian economy and government structure was supposed to operate. There, it identified an economy that was in turmoil and identified 4 main structural imbalances. I won't go through them all, but one in particular that it identified was the inadequacy in the provision of public infrastructure and services. And although it acknowledged, of course, that the results of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process would play a determining role in the nature of the Palestinian economy. In truth, it was choices on two issues would be particularly critical. The balance between the role of the public and private sector in the occupied territories and the nature of occupied territories' economic links to the rest of the world, including neighboring states. Now, of course, the World Bank advocated that the occupied territories would remain basically economically submissive to Israel, as well as could form relationships with pro-US Arab states like Jordan and Egypt in the Gulf. But in regards to the first question, the balance between public and private, the bank came out with a rather unpredictable outcome, so to say, or suggestion. It basically said that the world that when it comes to social health care provision and social services, we should advocate for a public sector, which is quite antithetical to Washington consensus politics, which at the time was dominant in 1993, and it's kind of a curious observation. Now, why they did that, the answer to it can be found not in volume 1, but actually in volume 6, where they go through this. And that was largely because when they came into the occupied territories, they were quickly forced to engage with the reality that there were large, deep, active social formations on the ground who were already active in social welfare provision. And in fact, they had made quite impressive accomplishments. Expenditures on health and education and welfare programs across the occupied territories were largely dominated by various clusters of different service providers that were seen as being affiliated with political factions. And in fact, I'm going to show you something that is not from the World Bank document, but it's actually from a classified United States US aid document. In 1993, this was a classified document, but basically the Americans studied the entire landscape of different social welfare provision organizations across the occupied territories. So on the left side column, you see all the different political factions that exist: Fatah, Popular Front, Palestine People's Party, Democratic Front, Hamas. Of course, there was also Israel and Jordan, which were active on the front. And then what they had regarding institutions for agriculture, healthcare, finance, industry, education. Obviously, this is very controversial because these organizations are actually NGOs that do not publicly show or claim to be representing political organizations. So this is based on actually intelligence material, but whether it's true or not, it's not for me to say, but the point is that's how they assessed the situation at the time. And that's how they saw things as a state, as an American state with active interests in the area. So the World Bank at the time noticed that people living in poorly serviced areas had begun to receive basic healthcare and social services from networks of grassroots voluntary organizations that had expanded rapidly since 1987, which was the period known as the First Intifada. Many of these voluntary and for-profit sectors were more advanced and had cornered certain niches of the market. So more than half, they accounted for more than half of all healthcare spending. They were providing more sophisticated and at times specialty niches such as CT scanners. They had half of primary healthcare facilities that were owned by these different networks, 30% of acute care hospital beds, etc. The World Bank found in the existence of these, now firstly it's important to say, they are all these organizations at the time, from Fatah at the top all the way down to the Israelis, were illegal, okay? So they are the pirate care providers at the time. But what the World Bank decided to say when they analyzed that actually this is quite an impressive sort of grassroots mobilization on behalf of all these parties, they saw what they called an inefficiency problem as well as an accountability problem. Now, it's rather ironic that the World Bank would call something inefficient because the concept of market allocation itself is not efficient at all either. And moreover, it tends to lump together and certainly when they accuse this situation of being unaccountable, it lumps together things like the Israelis who hadn't even added one hospital bed to the OPT healthcare system, and some of these organizations that had doubled the amount of healthcare provisions just in six years. So, but this for them was inefficient and unaccountable, and therefore they promoted the notion of a public sector being created. The public sector was the Palestinian Authority that was created and erected, largely by Western taxpayer dollars. But the Palestinian Authority, this public sector body that was created, was to be a body that was only to be animated by one of these parties, Fatah, the top party, which actually, according to this document, was actually the least capable organization at the time. They selected the least capable organization, gave it to one actor, created a Palestinian Authority for it to be the public sector and to provide for these services. And of course, not written into this whole arrangement was an understanding of the fact that, of course, the Palestinian Authority still enjoyed no sovereignty. It had no economic means to sustain itself. It was and remains financially dependent. In fact, 2/3 of its revenue sources come through Israel or international donors. And the result of this whole process was, okay, to some extent, they tried to redirect social welfare provision through this thing, but the other organizations were still around. They were forced to become more kind of NGO-like, so to speak, but it kind of froze the process there. But it didn't solve the larger question of social welfare provision in the context of occupation, where at the end of the day, if you want to bring healthcare provision like whatever, chemotherapy or whatever, the Israelis still control this. Israel still controls access, in and out, movement of people and goods. So it doesn't solve any of those questions, but it institutionally redesigned the situation. That's example one. The second example is the example of group marriages. Now, marriage and social reproduction at large in the occupied territories take place in a very complicated background, as I said, of military occupation, aggression, de-development, also physical isolation, and chronic political and economic instability. A host of additional demographic factors and psychosocial factors further compound the material and practical difficulties facing youth, in particular prolonging what's called their period of waithood. So waithood is the period in the literature when somebody is willing and able to get married, but can't, because there's some form of impediment that prevents them from actually moving to that final stage. So looking more in particular at, within this context, basically the group marriage phenomena kind of emerges as an act of pirate care to try and solve this situation. Now, in order to appreciate group marriages, we kind of need to go a little bit deeper into the context in which it's created. Group marriages emerged largely out of the Gaza Strip, which you may know is is actually far worse off than the rest of the occupied territories. In fact, poverty levels are 3 times the level that they are in the West Bank. Same with unemployment. In fact, in the last year, there has been an entire collapse of the economy in Gaza, where the amount of imported goods has more than halved. Basically, that's because there's no more purchasing power in Gaza anymore. $112 million of checks just bounced in 2017, and 42,500 people were arrested simply for not being able to pay their debts, which is shocking in a context where you're talking about only 2 million people. Of course, Gaza's 42% of the population is under 15, 70% is below the age of 35. So it's not just a question of economics, though. There's also customary practices which inform this concept of how and when and why Palestinians want to get married. So the folkloristic incarnations of Palestinian marriage have well-known and costly elements to it. I won't go through them because they probably won't mean too much, but most of these financial obligations actually fall upon the men, or the grooms, so to speak. And they also include the provision of some form of home, usually, for the future family and wife and family. So, but this, of course, delivering on the aspect of providing a home is very difficult if you're unemployed or have no opportunities, in addition to the fact that now Israel considers all forms of construction material dual use. So you cannot simply import cement and build a home, even if you do have them. Additionally, of course, Israel's aggressive policies particularly have targeted houses, and there is also a great limitation of land resources in Gaza. So it is estimated that the Gaza Strip, which, as I said, only has 2 million people in it, is in need of 250,000 new homes, which is a shocking amount of homes. The rental market is obviously, in a context like in the last Gaza war, 100,000 people were made homeless out of it. And so that has saturated the rental market, and costs are too high for people to do it. So this is the context in which waithood, at least the economic background. There's the psychosocial factor, as I said, too. Most Palestinians consider that the optimal age for Palestinian men to get married is between 24 and 29, women 18 to 24. The period of engagement, getting engaged. Now, when you get married in traditional under traditional Islamic norms, you sign an agreement called Katb al-Kitab, which is essentially a kind of engagement. Formally, you are married, but the marriage is not consummated unless you have a public celebration of it. And so this period, the Katb al-Kitab, the engagement, allows for you to actually formally date, basically, and get to know your partner. Are we okay with time? Yeah. Okay. So sorry. Yeah. So get to know your partner. So this period of engagement shouldn't last more than 4 months, or maybe at most a year. But more than that, it's considered too much. So if the person cannot get married during this period of engagement, then the couple has the potential to get divorced, which obviously has negative repercussions for both. In addition, 99% of women expect their husbands to be employed. 55% of people overall do not consider, respondents were against marrying a divorcee, and most women are against the concept of splitting up the mahr, which is the dowry figure, in installments. So you actually have to have capital to actually get married. So within this context, so this has created obviously a big bottleneck around marriage, and it has created to some extent a kind of hysteria within which certain social forces enter into the fray, saying there's a major crisis around marriage, around divorce, about people waiting too late to get married, and this is actually threatening Palestinian society, saying that it's equivalent to a nuclear, the head of the Sharia courts in Gaza said it's equivalent to a nuclear bomb. There's threats that this leads to criminal activity, or to people wanting to leave, or etc. So within this context of hysteria and fear and the overall economic situation, you have the potential for group marriages to take place. Group marriages are basically where third parties, whether they're political parties, charitable organizations, or individuals, basically insert themselves into this gap and provide for the couples the cost of the marriage celebration, in particular, which is usually the main cost that they have to take up initially. Of course, you have to figure out the housing by yourself, and you have to figure out the dowry as well. But in any case, group marriages take place often between 10 people to up to 2,000 people at a time. The financiers of this situation provide dresses and suits, a peripheral package of gifts, sometimes cash, and oftentimes coupons, which are given to each couple. The coupons are then exchanged in known stores for forms of home appliances or furnitures for the new couple in advance. Though I would never say so authoritatively, it's likely to assume that some of these commercial establishments where the coupons are exchanged are affiliated to the party that would be financing them. But even if they are not, a group wedding where you're marrying off 2,000 people, it cost $4 million. It's a huge amount of capital that is coming into Gaza, and a huge amount of power that the financiers have to be able to win over, buy up different forms of support and backing from different parts of the commercial class or whatnot. So just to sum up, basically, couples get to finally marry, ending their purgatory of waithood, and participate in the rites of passage of married adult life and what that means socially. Factions win loyal patrons, not only in terms of the bride and groom, but also potentially even families and their children, which will feel themselves indebted to the party that may have provided them the possibility to be born or whatever. Well, I don't know if the parties are doing that, but in any case, factions also win the favors of the commercial class, which provides services and appliances for the wedding, and a network chain and economy is thus threaded or braided together that can incorporate the interests of the organizers and funders, doing so in a way that may also allow these funds to be recycled internally through the organization, be this for personal profit or for buoying its wider agenda and policy space. One final aspect of this thing is the actual affective side of group marriages, the emotional side, so to speak. For instance, in 2000, after the Israeli military aggression of 2008-2009, in which 1,400 Palestinians were killed, you had a group wedding, which the procession of which ended in a school in which there had been a massacre in northern Gaza. And so the procession ends where this former massacre had taken place. And they had a group wedding of over 100 couples there, in which the Hamas leader, Mahmoud Zahar, basically said, northern Gaza is the wall of deterrence for the Strip from any Israeli aggression. They did it specifically in northern Gaza because they had had 550 people killed from northern Gaza in this area. And they wanted the association of space to be not just one of a massacre, but also one of life, one of rejuvenation, one of agency, so to speak. So he ends, today we are creating a celebration in every house in Palestine so as to say to the Americans, you cannot take our happiness from us, because we are preparing for an even greater celebration, the celebration of liberation and victory. These are some pictures of it. This is one financed by Turkey. That's why they're carrying the Turkish flag. We have to finish. The final concluding thoughts to bring it around. Pirate care is, in the end, what can we learn from the OPT experience? Pirate care is something political par excellence. It fills a necessary and important gap in social service provision. It can be a clarion call that draws attention to injustices and inequalities. It punctures neoliberal mythologies and its racist, xenophobic, and often colonialist corollaries, promoting values of solidarity, public goods, and social democracy. It represents the buds of political project. But the question is, what else is it and can it be? What is the rest of this project behind it? What is the strategy for transforming not only the downstream results of neoliberalism and imperialism, but also the upstream causes? What is its relation to the state? In the occupied territories, it's obvious, but in the West, it's not. And also, there are major questions around continuity in finance. When you bring in finance, if you want to have your pirate care activity sustained for long term, you have to solve a material question around it. And the question is, how do you solve that? In the Palestinian context, we had foreign funding played a major role in NGOization, in neutralizing, in turning accountability from the grassroots to the funder. And group weddings play an important role in doing that by translating this need into the existing neo-patrimonial structures that exist in Palestine. That's why the weddings are always saying, thank you, Abu Mazen, or this fellow on his hands saying, thank you to the Emirates who paid for his wedding. These are important questions that I think are embedded in all Western practices of pirate care, but we see them more clearly in the occupied territories. Thank you.